Galatians chapter 4, we're going to start with verse 21. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. Now I want to pause here. I'm jumping right into something that, if you guys recall, I told you last week, we're going to try to talk about God as creator in terms of the creation of the world order, like the world, the heavens, the earth, humanity, the animals, the plants, the things of the earth. The last 2 weeks, we talked about the creation of angels and the creation of demons. We're looking at God in this particular aspect as a creator. So you might wonder, why are we looking at Galatians? Well, hopefully it'll become clear as things unfold. But before I try to clarify why we're looking at Galatians, I just want to make you aware of a couple of things. First of all, make sure you understand the context. In the book of Galatians, Paul is writing to the church in Galatia. And what he's essentially condemning is this wide view, this wide-ranging perspective or view that many people had taken, that you had to become circumcised and you had to keep the law of God to be a Christian, to be saved. By that I mean, you essentially had to become Jewish. Like you had to fulfill the commandments of the Jewish law. You had to culturally take on the practices of the Jews. And Paul here is saying, for those of you who wish to be under the law, for those of you who wish to live according to the statutes and the requirements the Jews had, let me ask you something. Do you listen to the law? And when he talks about the law, I want you to understand, he's referencing the first 5 books of the Bible. He's not just talking about commandments. He's talking about Genesis through Deuteronomy, right? What the Jews called the law, the Torah, right? And so he's asking his Jewish listeners, or his Jewish Christian listeners, or his Gentile Christians who want to become more Jewish Christians, to consider, what does the Torah say? What does it teach us? And he begins to reference a story in the book of Genesis, the story of Abraham and the birth of his 2 sons. Now, of course, most of you are familiar, hopefully all of you are familiar with the story of the birth of Isaac, right? The promised child. Maybe fewer of you are aware of the story of the birth of his other son, Ishmael. What you need to understand is Abraham, of course, waited a long time to get a kid. He was 100 years old before Isaac would be born to him. He received a promise when he was 75 from God that he would ultimately have a son, and he waited expectantly for 25 years, well beyond the prime of his life. And over the course of that time, he got anxious, no doubt. His wife, Sarah, got anxious, and she began to question the promise of God. And she said to Abraham, what if God does not intend to bring a son through me? What if actually what he wants you to do is to take my maidservant Hagar, sleep with her, and get her pregnant? Let's take that means, because who knows, maybe that's God's will. Maybe that's how he wants this to happen. And Abraham went ahead and acquiesced, and he slept with Hagar. Hagar became pregnant, and she did give birth to a son. She gave birth to the son Ishmael. And it would be many years later before Isaac would be born. So that's kind of the story he's referencing, something which, if he spoke to anybody versed in the Torah, in the law, anybody with an understanding, just a simple understanding of the background of Jewish history, they would be fully aware of this. So he says this, Abraham had 2 sons, one by a bondwoman. So who's the bondwoman? Hagar. And when he says bondwoman, she was literally Sarah's slave. The other by a free woman, Sarah, Abraham's wife. That would be Isaac. Verse 23, but he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh. What he means by that is really simple and obvious. He who was born of the bondwoman, Ishmael, was born according to the normal human means, right? Sarah was barren. Sarah could not have kids. Sarah was in her 80s. All of this it's impossible that she should be able to have a son. That is a physical impossibility. Hagar was not barren. She was a young woman. It was very possible for her to have a son. So when he says that the first son, Ishmael, was born of the flesh, he means the first son was born according to the normal course of human events. It was born the way that things are. However, he of the free woman, this is Isaac, was born through promise. Okay? So the son of Sarah was promised, as you guys know. Abraham, as I mentioned a moment ago, had received promises time and again that Sarah would give birth to a son. And the last one came sometime after Ishmael, his son, had been born. God appeared to Abraham and said, Ishmael is not the chosen son. Ishmael is not to be the seed. Sarah is going to be the one who's going to give birth. And so what Paul's saying here is he's saying, you have to understand, when Sarah gave birth, it was because of God's promise. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. Verse 24. Now, here's kind of the key and why I'm having you guys look at this, because this is not meant to be a message about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Verse 24. Which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Okay, so he stops and he says, this whole story, the story about Hagar and Sarah, it is symbolic. Now, by the way, please don't misunderstand me, nor misunderstand Paul. I don't think he's saying it didn't literally happen. I think it did literally happen, and I think he thinks it literally happened. But he is saying, from this we learn something symbolic. He says, Hagar reminds us of the law, of the giving of the law through Moses. Where was the law given through Moses? On Mount Sinai. Okay? Continue. And then the last part of that in verse 24, which gives birth to bondage. Because if you are subject to the law, you are in bondage. Why is that? Well, he's talking here about salvation. What makes a person saved? It's real simple. If you are saved in accordance with the law, you are in bondage. Why? Because your whole life is to be assessed on the basis of works and what you do. And you will be a slave because you will constantly be self-assessing and you'll constantly be worrying whether or not the next time you're going to mess up just enough to finally ruin everything. That's a bondage. It's a slavery. He says, this is Hagar, verse 25. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. So I want you to follow what he's saying here. The story of Hagar represents Mount Sinai, which represents Jerusalem. So now he stops and he says, it represents the people of Israel right now who are in bondage, who have not heard the gospel and have not received the gospel of Jesus Christ. But then he says, verse 26, but the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. The Jerusalem which is above is free. So we had Hagar, who is Mount Sinai, which is Jerusalem in his day. But now we refer to this new Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that is above. Skip down to verse 28. We, brethren, as Isaac was, that's key, we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. Understand, Isaac was given by a promise from God. It was an impossible promise. Sarah couldn't have kids. She couldn't have kids when she was young. She definitely can't have kids when she's 90 years old. But God said it was going to be done, and it happened, which means it came only from the power of God. Hagar gave birth by natural means, the way normal humans do. Well, salvation by normal means would be salvation by obedience, salvation by works, salvation by keeping the law as it was supposed to be kept perfectly throughout your whole life. Does that make sense? Skip down to continue on in verse 29. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, which is true in the story of Genesis, we find that Ishmael and Hagar will mock Isaac and will disdain him, and it will actually drive Sarah to tell Abraham that he needs to send his son Ishmael away. As they persecuted the one according to the Spirit, so it is now. So it is now. Verse 30. Nevertheless, what does the scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So in the second analogy, we have Sarah, right? You had Hagar, Sarah. Hagar corresponded to Mount Sinai, which is the law. Sarah corresponds to the promise. Sarah corresponds to grace. Sarah corresponds to new life. Sarah corresponds to the gospel. And both of those correspond to their own respective Jerusalems. Hagar to Old Jerusalem, Sarah to New Jerusalem, the Jerusalem which is above, the Jerusalem which makes us all free. Now, I ran through that. If I had more time, I'd like to really sit down and break it down, and that was about as fast as I could say it. I don't want to spend a lot of time with it. I'm sure that raises all sorts of questions. I wanted to draw your attention to one thing, and it's going to have pertinence, you'll see, as we move forward in this discussion, and that is that sometimes Bible stories are meant to be used allegorically. What Paul did here is he used allegory. Now, this is not to say that the events didn't happen in this way. It's not to say there wasn't a Sarah. It's not to say there wasn't a Hagar. It's not to say that Sarah did not receive the promise of a son. I believe she 100% did. I believe she gave birth at 90 years of age. I believe that what happened according to the story was historical and accurate. But you need to understand that Paul does something very important here. He uses allegory or metaphor, an extended metaphor really, to try to explain a spiritual principle based on a story taught in the Bible. Okay? Now, I'm going to come back to this here in a bit, but I'm going to shift gears. I wanted to do that as kind of an intro to get you guys thinking, and partly to get you wondering why in the world I started with that. Let's get to Genesis. Genesis chapter 1. We're going to read through it. I'm going to just try to make some simple observations while we read it, and then I'm going to come back and kind of comment on the main things I want you to take away from our time in this study. Verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. I want to stop here and just make a couple of comments. First of all, you should have a difficult time understanding what he's describing. You should have a difficult time forming a mental picture of what he's saying. He says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but the earth was formless and void. What does it mean for it to be formless? You understand? Like, what does it mean for it to have no form? Void, I think you could potentially have kind of an understanding. You could take that it means that it was empty, devoid of any life or something like that. But what does it mean for the earth, which when you think of the earth, when I think of the earth, if I think of God making an earth, I picture a sphere. I picture a spherical object, the earth that he created, which has a form. How does he make it without a form? Verse 3, then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Oh, I forgot to remind you of something I mentioned a couple weeks ago. It does say he made the heavens and the earth. People too often draw the conclusion that by heavens, it means the dwelling place of angels and demons, the dwelling place of God, the place that we all go when we die. But fairly close to universally, in the Old Testament at least, when it says heavens, it means the sky where the sun and the moon and the stars are. There's the earth down here, and there's the heavens out there. So 3, God says, let there be light. There was light. Verse 4, God saw the light. He saw that it was good. And here's a word that is going to be repeated over and over again in this chapter. It was good. It was good. It was good. Which is important for stuff that's going to come up down the road. One thing you always have to remember about God's creative process, as God is creator, he creates things that are good. Never something that is bad. Whatever he makes, it is good. God saw the light, verse 4, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. I don't know what that means or what that looks like. Divided the light from the darkness. Does that mean he made a declaration that light and dark were two different things? Does it mean that he located light in one area and located darkness in another? I don't know. Verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Okay. Light, darkness, the light part day, the dark part night. I kind of get it. That somewhat makes sense. Verse 7, thus God made the firmament. And by the way, a firmament is any kind of expanse of something. It can be any kind of material. Most people think here the firmament that is being spoken of is like basically the stuff within our atmosphere, the thing that separates like us, Earth, from the deep heavens way out there. There was a firmament in the midst of the waters. Now, you might stop and say, oh, well, that's referencing land, right? Well, just wait. This is even weirder. And let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and he divided the waters, listen, which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So what this seems to say is there were a bunch of waters somewhere in this formless mass of earth, and he split them apart by an expanse of something, and there were waters underneath and waters above, and the expanse in between was called heaven. And here it's hard to say exactly what he's referencing, but people tend to think it's the atmosphere. It's the part on this side of whatever it is outside of the sphere of the earth. Verse 9, then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Again, there it is. It was good. Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed, according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Okay, so what has he done so far? He's separated light from dark. He's put an expanse in between two sets of waters. One set of waters is above the heavens, one set of waters below the heavens. In the midst of those waters, he puts dry land. And then he puts trees and plants and things of that nature. 3 days so far. Now comes something quite important. Verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, seasons, days, and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. So remember, there's this firmament, this expanse. It supposedly separates two sets of waters. There's land down here. There are plants growing on this land down here. But now he says he's going to make lights. And what's he going to do with these lights? He's going to put them in the firmament, that is this expanse, that is in between these two sets of waters. What are these lights? Verse 16, God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day. So what is that? Sun. The lesser light to rule the night. He made stars also. So what are these lights that he put in the firmament that separates the waters? The sun, the moon, and the stars. So now this expanse got really big because those stars, they go out a ways, right? So all of these things are now hung in this expanse, in this firmament. Continue verse 17. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Again, as with everything else, God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Fourth day. One thing I'd like to point out. We've had 4 days, but only one of those days has a what? A sun. How do you have a day without a sun? So we had 3 days, no sun. I don't know. This is one of those things I don't know. Verse 20, then God said, let the waters abound with abundance of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of heavens. Sorry, by the way, we're reading a lot. I'm going to come back and kind of explain some things that hopefully will make sense out of this. God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, right? So we have the fish and the sea and the various mammals that are seafaring mammals. Birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So we have birds now in this firmament that he created. Verse 21, so God created sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And again, God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the waters and the seas. Let the birds multiply on the earth. He makes all these things and he says, be fruitful, fill everything. Verse 23, so the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Verse 24, then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures according to its kind, cattle, creeping things, beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the next thing is now the land creatures, big and small, fill the earth. And then, of course, the big thing, verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Very important. The idea here is it's a crowning achievement kind of thing. There is somebody who is made in our image, which I've talked about when I talked about the language of the Trinity. Go back and listen to that teaching if you get a chance. God said, let us make man in our image, pointing to the triune nature of God. So he fashions man, and what is man? He has dominion. All right? He has dominion. I'll talk later about what it means to be made in the image of God, but one thing that seems to really come out in this text is man has dominion. He rules over the world like God rules. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. By the way, the implication there is, I want you to understand when he says God made man in his own image, it's there, the word for man means human being, right? It's not referencing males. He says God made humans, man, in his own image, and then he specifies male and female both he created in his image. Verse 28, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, here, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the earth. What is your call, man? It is to rule. It is to have dominion over the earth. Verse 29, and God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also, to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. And so he gives the plants to humanity to eat, which, by the way, he does not give animals. However, he will later. After Noah, God, I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about it, but after Noah comes out of the ark, God specifically tells him, just as I once gave mankind plants to eat, I now give you animals to eat. Verse 30, and to every beast of the earth and every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Verse 31, then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. A very important verse. Everything that he made was indeed very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Now I have 4 more verses I want to read in chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth and all of the hosts in them were finished. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had done. He rested on the 7th day from all his work, which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day. He sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. So the 7th day he rested. Very interestingly, it does not say, and the evening and the morning were the 7th day. It never says that. And then verse 4, something very interesting. This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Okay, let's stop. What do we make of that? How do we interpret that? How do we read that? What's the right way of making sense out of Genesis chapter 1? And I should add, our principle and the principle by which we read and interpret Genesis chapter 1 will not just apply to how we read Genesis chapter 1, but it will most likely apply to how we read the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It'll have a big impact on how you read those first 11 chapters. What I want you to understand, I guess before we go anywhere, kind of before we move, is that in general today, now if you were to go back through church history and take a look at how different people have interpreted the Bible, how different people have interpreted Genesis, there have been lots of schemes and lots of attempts and ways to try to make sense out of it. Today, for the most part, there are three general ways that people interpret Genesis. And amongst those three ways, there are like subdivisions or subcategories. Like there are kind of different nuanced ways to kind of look at Genesis, under these three different ways. I'm going to talk to you about each of these, okay? Now, as I do so, if you guys recall a couple weeks ago, I made comment about how I was going to be talking, or 2 weeks ago, I talked about primary and secondary doctrines. So if you were here for that, you know what I'm talking about. If not, just a brief kind of summary. Primary doctrines are doctrines that are essential to salvation. They are essential to being a Christian. Secondary doctrines are doctrines that are not essential to that. Something important to understand, because Christians disagree. They disagree most vehemently. Sometimes they disagree angrily. And if you want to go back and listen to that study, if you didn't hear it, I'm a big advocate for not disagreeing angrily and for trying to have reasoned discussion. I think I alluded to the fact, a lot of people ask me, how do you know the things you know, or how have you learned the things you've learned? Mostly because I spent a lot of time talking with people I disagreed with, right? Incidentally, talking with people you agree with is very useless when it comes to developing doctrine. And that's because you're just in an echo chamber. It's a sounding board, right? You're just saying the same things that other people are saying. And if you recall, I quoted you that proverb which said that the case of a man sounds good until he is cross-examined. That is, until somebody else who disagrees with him comes along and challenges it and says, wait a minute, have you thought of it from this side? Humans are notoriously bad at trying to think of things from multiple sides. And one of the things I want to do here is to try to some degree, present some of those other sides to hopefully clarify for you what it is you believe. And by the way, I'm going to be very clear on what I believe. I'm not afraid to share my view, so I'm going to explain it. And if you guys recall, a few weeks ago, I said it's something that will probably tick off almost every side, and I'll explain why. But before I do that, I want to mention the three basic views, essentially. Number one, what people refer to as the literal view. They believe that the book of Genesis was meant to be interpreted literally, and that when it says things like the evening and the morning were a day, that it was a literal day, and that when God created the world, it happened in exactly that way, like point for point, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then what followed were these several steps: the dividing of the light from the dark, the dividing of the two oceans or the two seas with the firmament in the middle, the creation of the sun specifically on the fourth day, things of that nature. The creation of plants, incidentally, the day before. These are specific things that if you take a literal interpretation of the book of the first chapter of Genesis anyway, this is what you will believe. A second general framework by which you interpret. Oh, actually, you know what? Let me also add this. Remember how I said a moment ago that there are three basic frameworks through which you can interpret, but then there are kind of subcategories or subdivisions? Some people interpret the first couple of chapters literally. They would say, we believe it happened just like it was written, but they have some different interpretive schemes to some of the phrasing and some of the terminology. And so we're going to talk about, in particular, something that people refer to as the day-age theory, or the way of interpreting Genesis through the day-age theory. And what that means is these guys do interpret chapter 1 literally. They believe it happened just as it's laid out, but they will say that when they speak of a day in which God created something, they're giving basically a geological time period. That's not really a day as in a literal day, morning and evening or something along those lines. It's a period of time, okay? So each one represents a geological era. That is technically a literal interpretation. It is just a nuanced take on a literal interpretation where they change or they have a different use of the meaning of the word day. The second type of position, or the second interpretive scheme or framework, is called the allegorical framework. That is, you interpret Genesis 1, and these people who hold to this view, tend to interpret the entire first 11 chapters of Genesis as an allegory. This is why I started with Galatians, so that you can understand what I meant by an allegory. It's exactly what Paul just did, right? Where Paul walked through and said, Hagar is Mount Sinai, which is the old Jerusalem, and it is bondage. Whereas Sarah is the promise, and she is the new Jerusalem, and it is life and freedom. That kind of a thing. He makes this symbolic interpretation of this text. A lot of people hold to this view. One kind of specific view of the allegorical interpretation is what people call the framework theory, where they actually break down Genesis chapter 1 into a couple of triads, that is 3 different sections where you have a created piece of space, and then in the first 3 sections, and in the second of the 3 sections, you have a ruler put over each one, right? So you have the seas, and the ruler over the seas are the creatures within the sea, right? And so they kind of work down that way. The third particular kind of information, or kind of interpretation, is called the gap theory. So let me actually take you back to Genesis 1 to take a look at a text here, so you can kind of appreciate what the gap theory is. I referenced it a little bit ago when we talked about angels. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, the earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. What the gap theorists hold is that there is a huge period of time that elapsed between verse 1 of chapter 1 and verse 2 of chapter 1. That in verse 1, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that's speaking of God's first creative act. And then tons of time passed. We don't know how much. Probably billions of years. And then after that billions of years passed, we find verse 2, that the earth, and here they basically, and I have to be honest, I really can't speak too well to this, but they say that this is a poor translation, which remember how I warned you about that? Don't listen to people who say things are poor translations, unless it's me. Verse 2, when it says that the earth was without form and void, they'll argue what it should say is that the earth became formless and void. That it, in other words, the implication is once it wasn't formless and void, and then something really nasty happened, which made it formless and void. And so it became that. That's the point that they end up making. Now, one thing I can say about that, I don't know Hebrew, so I feel kind of weird trying to chime in on that bit of conversation. By the way, just because somebody stands up here, or like if somebody's teaching on this ever, just because they utter the Hebrew words, you guys know that doesn't mean they actually know it, right? Like just because you state the Hebrew words doesn't mean, because I've heard often I'll hear gap theorists talk about this, and they'll state the Hebrew words, but that doesn't actually mean they know Hebrew. You really do want to talk to somebody who you know knows Hebrew if you're going to ask them, how do you interpret this? But I've told you guys that there's one thing that I, in general, try to go with. Actually, and I'll go with 2 things here that I think give me some insight into whether or not that should be the earth was without form and void, or became without form and void. And that is, every single Bible translation that I've ever seen, ever, says the earth was without form and void. Never in my life have I seen one that said the earth became formless and void. Never. But I don't know. And also I'll add this. I do know a few languages, and I've studied a bit of linguistics, and I've taught language for 12 years. And I do know this. I've never seen in a language where the word is and became or becomes are the same word. They're always different words. I don't know if that's true in Hebrew, but it's certainly true in the languages I've worked with. I'm actually going to spend a bit of time here on gap theory for a minute, because I'm going to, I apologize, dismiss it very quickly. Not because I think it's wrong for somebody to hold it. A lot of people do hold it. Chuck Smith held it. At least he did when he taught the 8,000 series of his teaching through the Bible. If you guys are familiar with that, he spends a lot of time talking about the gap theory. So I don't want to dismiss it because I don't think it's I think it's wrong or you're bad to hold it. I'm going to dismiss it because, one, I don't believe it, but also, two, because I don't really encounter a lot of theologians who believe it. At this point, it's not a vogue position to hold. And I think it's something I can explain pretty easily, and I can explain why I don't believe it. And part of why I don't believe it is what I just told you. I tend to trust Bible translators. It should be was. The second reason, so there are two reasons that I've heard gap theorists try to defend this notion of a gap theory. The first is the translation of that word was. The earth was formless and void. That's the first. They challenge that and say that it should mean became. The second is they'll turn you to the book of Isaiah chapter 45. And why don't you guys turn with me there? Book of Isaiah chapter 45. Verse 18. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. Now I want to pause here. What I have been told, and I think this is definitely true, when it says who did not create it in vain, that phrasing is the same phrasing of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when it says, and it was formless and void. The translators chose two different words, which, by the way, is fair. Translators do that. You can translate one word in one language differently in a different spot. And so some of your Bibles may actually read differently and say something like, it was not created void or formless, okay? So here's the thing. They'll say this is a contradiction. Genesis says it was created formless and void. Isaiah says it was not created formless and void. Well, I think there's a simple answer to that. In Isaiah, he's not speaking here as to how the creation happened. He's talking about purpose, meaning he did not create the earth to be formless and void. He did not create it to be pointless. He created it with purpose and intent. So those are my answers to those two things. There's one more reason why, of course, gap theory prevailed for a short period of time, and that is really the reason underlying why we're having this discussion at all. And that is contemporary science really, really throws some wrenches into our interpretation of Genesis 1. Contemporary science, on the whole, tells us, or seems to tell us, that the earth and the universe that we inhabit is really old. That the earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and that the universe is about 13.5 billion years old. And if the earth is 4.5 billion years old, and it was created in 7 days, the way it's described, then the whole chronology of the beginning of the earth till now, it just doesn't really fit. It doesn't fit, and it doesn't square with the accepted narrative that we have discovered through science. That's just the way it is. And so people, of course, now then are faced with a certain kind of crisis, and everybody should, to some degree, feel the weight of this crisis, and that is, we have here a whole bunch of argumentation and reasoning that tells us that the world came about in a certain way. It's 4.5 billion years old, 13.5 billion years old. And you kind of have a couple of options with it. You can either say to them, oh, you guys do know what you're talking about, you guys who tell me this. You have good reasons for thinking it, so I probably should believe it, which means I probably shouldn't believe that Genesis chapter 1 means what it says in a literal sense. Or I can say, Genesis 1 says what it says, therefore you guys are wrong. And that tends to be how people kind of approach this issue. People tend to either go, I'm going with science on this, or I'm going with Genesis. And then there becomes this real big fight between the two, right? Gap theorists, as with the allegorical guys, they're trying to make it mesh and make it make sense, and trying to figure out how all of this can work together. And so what the gap theorists will say is they'll say, oh, well, that period of time in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a big, long period of time in there. Maybe a lot of the stuff scientists say happened in there. They'll also throw this in. They'll say also, it could be during that time that the war in heaven happened, that the angels fell, that Satan and his minions fell. All of that kind of stuff could have happened in this gap. so maybe. To which I would say, yeah, maybe. I could be wrong. I've never very strongly entertained the gap theory, but I could be wrong. All that could be right. The arguments for it don't convince me. So that's all I'm going to say about it. When I say I'm going to dismiss it, I mean I'm not going to bring it back up again. So I apologize if you're gap theorist. I don't think it's a dumb view to hold or anything. It's just not one I want to spend a lot of time talking about. I do want to go over here to the literal versus the allegorical. And in this, I do want to talk about the day-age theory. I want to talk about all three of these things. And in talking about these, first of all, I guess, I'll kind of finally explain to you what I think and why I think it, and why I think it's probably would be upsetting to everybody. First of all, I do take the book of Genesis literally. I do believe that the world we live in was created in 7 days, day and 24-hour periods roughly, something along those lines. 7 days, that's the created world. I do believe that does not square with most of accepted science, and I think there could be lots of reasons why that is. But I also want to add this. I do not think that this is a primary doctrine. So this is one of the things, and by the way, I think that very intensely. So I could upset people who are allegorists or who gap theorists or whatever by saying I'm a literalist. And then I could accept a lot of the literalists because most of the literalists I know do say it's not a primary doctrine, but they don't really mean it. You know what I mean? Like they'll say it's not a primary doctrine, it's not essential to salvation, but they don't act like it isn't. You know, like it is a huge, huge thing. And I don't want to say it's not a huge thing because I think everything we believe is a huge thing. I think the things that we believe matter, and I think they affect the way we live our lives. I think that's a fundamental reality. So of course they matter. But what I want is I want conversation, and I want argument, and I want people to listen to each other. And I want people, of course, also to be charitable in talking to one another. Instead of just automatically saying, well, you just haven't, you're an idiot or you haven't thought through things because you are closed-minded or, well, you just don't believe the Bible and you only want to listen to what the world has to say. All of that, I just want everybody in those instances to stop and try to be charitable. Try to ask yourself, what good reason might they have for thinking about things the way they are? And so for me, I tend to be a literalist. I should also add, I'm not a very vigorous literalist. I am one of those guys who has no problem saying, for the sake of argument, let's imagine the world is 13 billion years old. I should also add that when I have conversations, like I did when I was in Amsterdam, in Holland, I was staying in Amsterdam, and I was sleeping in a hostel, and I snore quite a bit. And most of the people sleeping around me in the hostel were guys on my team, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But there was one guy who consistently was sleeping above me directly every single day for like a week. And I just felt really bad because I thought I was keeping him up with my snoring. So I finally said one morning we woke up, which it's kind of weird, being in a place like this where, you're just sharing a room with all these people you don't know. And I said, hey, man, sorry, I know I snore. I hope it's not keeping you up. And he goes, yeah, man, you do. And I said, hey, I'm so sorry. And I don't know how it happened, but that immediately turned into an hour-long conversation at the foot of our bed talking about biology, because he's a biologist, studied birds. I forget exactly what kind of biologist that is. Ornithologist? He's an ornithologist. So, we got to talking, and then I said, hey, well, why don't we get together for coffee sometime and chat more about this? And so here's the thing. When I talked to him, I didn't say, dude, world was created in 7 days. You got to accept it, and let's stop talking all this nonsense. You actually have to kind of engage their argument. You know what I mean? Like, he's going to tell me why he thinks that evolution happened. And that's a question I asked him. And I dealt with that issue, and I tried to argue with it scientifically. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate. And also, I think it's appropriate that when you enter into an argument, even though, of course, entering into an argument, your goal is always to convince somebody of something. That's, like, by definition, why you argue. You're trying to convince them of something. You should go in to some degree saying, I don't know everything, and I could be wrong on some things, and I'd be happy to learn some things here. I think that's always good, just in general conversation. So that's why I said I think I would upset people, because I am a literalist. And I'm going to explain why I'm a literalist. Probably not going to get to it today because we got 14 minutes left, but I'll get to it next week. But I am also just very much committed to this fact that people who are not literalists can be Christians, maybe not all literalists, or all non-literalists. Richard Dawkins, definitely not a Christian. He's certainly, I don't know, maybe he's not, he just doesn't believe the Bible is true in any sense. So, but I do want to stop here and just talk about allegory, though. So having talked about literalness, I want to talk about allegory, and I want to say, again, before I introduce this, I am avowedly not an allegorist when it comes to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. However, I do not want to dismiss people who think that you could possibly interpret the scriptures allegorically in some sense, okay? And I'm going to explain why, first and foremost. Christians, and understandably, have a great fear of allegory and metaphor. They have a fear of allegory and metaphor because, like I said, for good reason, because there are a lot of non-Christians who like to go around and say things like, oh, well, the Bible is great. It's full of all sorts of cool spiritual truths. And who can understand it? And who can interpret it anyway, right? When the Bible says that Jesus died and rose again, there's probably some good pattern of life that we could have learned from that, which there is. You can learn that, of course, laying your life down for the sake of others gives life to people in certain ways. Yes. But here's the thing. It's very important to me. It's very important to us that we believe that while that is true, Jesus did in fact die, and he did in fact resurrect from the dead as a matter of fact. Okay? And so what happens is a lot of Christians being afraid that you might, on that slippery slope, come to the point where you just start allegorizing everything in the Bible and just throwing it out. And you might allegorize Jesus' death and resurrection, which would be bad. Paul himself says, 1 Corinthians 15, he says, if Jesus Christ is not resurrected from the dead, literally, physically, then we of all men are most miserable. We are still in our sins. He very emphatically, repeatedly in 1 Corinthians 15 drives home this point. Jesus died and he resurrected, and it's not a metaphor, it's not an allegory. So consequently, because of our fear of being on that slippery slope of allegory, we try to say maybe nothing is allegorical. That's patently not true either. And that's the thing you have to understand. The Bible has lots of metaphors. It has lots of allegories. Some examples. Actually, before I give the examples, let me point this out. The Bible, and this is something people don't quite understand, the Bible speaks in normal human language. Like we tend to think that the Bible, it is a holy book. It is inspired by God, but he used human instruments. And in using human instruments, he intended to speak in human language. And he intended to use the kinds of wordings and phrasings that you and I would use on any given day. There's nothing about the way it is worded that is weird. It is normal human speech. And you and I, we speak in allegory, and we speak in metaphor, and we speak in hyperbole, and we do all of these things when we talk that the Bible does too. Okay, some examples then of metaphor and allegory. John chapter 10, verses 1 through 21. You don't need to turn to it. I'm just going to throw them out at you. The story of the good shepherd, right? Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. He is not literally a shepherd. At no point in the scripture did it ever say that his particular career was keeping sheep. He's using a metaphor to try to explain something about himself. John chapter 10, verse 9. He says, which is in that same section, he switches his metaphor and he says, I am the gate of the sheep. He is not a gate. He's not a gate. John chapter 6, verse 35, he says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. And he says, if anybody eats me, he has life in him. John chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Remember when he meets the woman at the well and she asks him if he wants her to pull some water up from the well. And he says, if you only knew who it was who was talking to you, you would ask of him, and he would give you a special kind of water. He says, this water, if you drink it, he says, you'll be thirsty again. But the water that I give, you will never thirst. And it will be a wellspring of life bubbling up inside of you. Metaphor. It's not real water that he's talking about that is going to come into her body. Here's one, and this just shows the problem of dealing with metaphors. In all three of the synoptic gospels, the night before he was to die, Jesus took a piece of bread and he said, this is my body. And here we have a problem if you're familiar with the theological history of the church, because people died over this one, right? Because a lot of people said, this is my body, meaning Jesus literally, physically, his body, when you eat communion bread, you are eating his body physically. You're not eating bread, you're eating flesh. And when you drink the wine, you are not drinking wine, you are drinking blood. And it's not just Catholics who believe that. Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, the guy who started this whole thing, this whole experiment, firm believer in that. And in fact, the first significant split and fight between two Protestant Christians was Martin Luther versus Ulrich Zwingli. You guys remember Zwingli? Mentioned him a couple weeks ago. He's the guy who burned down the barn with all the Anabaptists in it. Yeah, he loved Luther. And he wanted to keep things together with Luther, but he just didn't believe that the bread was actually a body. And he didn't believe that the cup was actually blood. And so he said, why don't we get together and debate it? Now, this was before he burned down the church with all the people in it. So Luther didn't think, oh, he's a guy who burns down churches if you disagree with him. So Luther says, yes, let's get together. And a whole bunch of people came together. And the two main speakers, the two main guys, Luther and Zwingli, we're going to argue it out. And the argument was real simple. And they just kind of repeat it over and over again. Martin Luther stood up. He literally, when I say he just repeated it, Luther finally just came to the point where he just repeated it. He pounded his fist on the lectern at which he stood, and he said, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. It's Latin for this is my body. This is my body. But Zwingli goes, but there are metaphors. It's my body. The Bible says it. This is my body. This is my body. Are you trying to say the Bible is metaphorical? And Zwingli goes, here, yes. Here, yes. That's part of the debate. Now, I wanted to bring this example up because everybody knows that there are metaphors in the Bible. Everybody knows there are allegories. And we all have this fear of being on this slippery slope of falling into being like that guy that says, maybe Jesus' death and resurrection is just a metaphor. We don't ever want that. So I want a good system, a good rule that I can apply to every passage in the Bible, that I can apply it and I can say, here we know this is not meant to be a metaphor. This is meant to be taken literal. And here's the problem. There just isn't a really obvious good rule. I've heard people try to say, whenever the Bible says, what's coming up next is a metaphor. The problem is the Bible never does that. It never says, just so you know, what I'm about to say is a metaphor. Look at John chapter 10. Jesus never begins to use his metaphors by saying what I'm about to say is a metaphor. The second thing I've heard people say is, only interpret it metaphorically or allegorically if it is absurd not to do so. Jesus is obviously not a gate. Okay, that could work as a principle. But is it absurd to think he's a good shepherd? I don't think so. He might, had I not known a little bit more about him, I might have thought, oh, he just said he's a shepherd. There's no absurdity in that. The truth is, it's really hard to find an absolute thing which says this is clearly a metaphor. I think the best I can give you is, we're humans. We use metaphors all the time. We know them when we hear them, don't we? Usually. Guess what? Not always. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes people say something metaphoric and we go, and then somebody says, nah, it's a metaphor, man. I don't mean it seriously. You know? Today it wasn't really a metaphor I used. One of my students really started panicking. I don't remember even what I said. She just made a comment. Oh, she was going to give a presentation and she said, I'm scared because everybody's going to hate me. And I said, you're absolutely right. They will totally hate you if you don't do it perfectly. Now, I thought it was obvious that I was being sarcastic because I think it's preposterous to think that any one of those kids are going to care if she doesn't do it perfectly. But she started panicking and I'm like, whoa, God, I was just being sarcastic. I'm so sorry. She just took me literally. Sometimes we just get it wrong, right? And I think when we approach the scripture, I think that's what we need to do. We need to recognize, look, there are metaphors and there are allegories and they are used. And sometimes the writer is very clear to make it sure that we understand it's an allegory. But oftentimes we just have to kind of go with what it seems like, to the best that we can given the context. C.S. Lewis, by the way, my hero, and this is, just so you know, one of the reasons I end up kind of I can't say that I form all of my theological views based off of C.S. Lewis, because I don't. I definitely disagree with him on a ton of things. But I do often use him as a measure, and I say, well, he's a Christian, and he believed that weird thing, right? C.S. Lewis believed that the first 11 chapters of Genesis were allegorical. He believed they were allegories. He did not believe that they were historical fact. He did not believe that they literally happened. He did not believe in a literal Adam and Eve. He did not believe in a Noah. I believe he's wrong. That's the thing I want to make clear. I believe all of those things were factual, real things. However, I also believe he's a Christian. And I don't believe that he just believed that because he wanted to impress the atheists that he hung out with. I actually read his reasoning for why the first 11 chapters of Genesis he thinks are allegory. And his reasoning was, doesn't it just sound like it? Doesn't it just sound like it? That's it. To which I said, as if I'm having a conversation with him, Mr. Lewis, actually, to which I thought, I can kind of see why you think that. I can kind of see that. But I also can't necessarily, but still not comfortable in saying that, I think. I mean, I don't think that's a good enough reason to make me think that those are allegorical. He goes on and he says, the first 11 chapters are very different from chapter 12, which is true. You start reading chapter 12 on up, where you start reading Abraham. And if you ask Lewis, he would say, that's history. Abraham, Sarah, all of that happened. See, Lewis believed in miracles. He believed Sarah gave birth to a son by miracle. C.S. Lewis believed Jesus rose from the dead. He's just trying to make sense of what he reads. And so, I still have a lot more to talk about on this topic. We'll talk about it next week. But I just want you guys to leave this place as, before we, thinking about this, that we grow as we converse. We grow as we speak with each other. We grow as we talk. We grow spiritually and we grow mentally. We learn. And I have tried to live a life conversing with people in person, conversing through books. And what I'm doing up here, what I've been doing over these last classes, the way I teach this class, honestly, is often just kind of what has gone through my head over the last 20 years to a certain degree. It's the product of a whole lot of conversations I've had. I sit here and I say, well, C.S. Lewis said this, and this other guy said this, and this is what I think, and this is why I think it. And I try to leave that with you. And I want you to take from it what you will. But as you walk out of here, I would ask, above all, as you prepare for the next week, which, by the way, will be our last for a while. I probably will do something in the summer, so be watching. I'm sure we'll announce it at church, or I'm sure we'll announce it here on Wednesdays. Obviously Wednesday night Bible study is going to continue. Tucker will be here. Mark Dyrud will fill in, I'm sure, from time to time as well. They'll both be teaching. I will be back probably in the summer, certainly in the fall. But as you prepare, just in this upcoming week, as we get ready for that last time when we get together, I just want you to be thinking about how to understand where other believers are coming from and how to have good conversations with them and how not to immediately jump to, oh, he has some bad motivation for thinking this bad thing. Now, by the way, as I tell you this, please don't take this to mean that I'm saying it doesn't matter what you believe or that truth is relative. As I told you before, all of my beliefs I think are true. And I think every single person who disagrees with any specific belief I have is wrong. You understand? And also, as I said a couple weeks ago, that does not mean I think I know everything. Like, I know I'm wrong about things, I just don't know what things I'm wrong about. And that's why we have conversations. That's why we talk through things. And by the way, reason doesn't necessarily resolve it all. Very reasonable, rational people believe very different things. Okay? Oh, and by the way, very reasonable, rational people believe crazy things, nutty things. I remember in college, I don't know why I'm going to leave with this. This is going to be the last thing. But I remember in college, the number one philosopher in the world at the time was a guy from Princeton named David Lewis. Everybody revered David Lewis. And no joke, if you read his stuff, you would go, oh my goodness, this is a colossal intellect. This man has a mind that is unbelievable. And he believed some of the weirdest things you will ever hear of. He believed that there were an infinite number of worlds, possible worlds, that were that exist, where every single possibility that could ever feasibly be imagined or that is logically possible would be realized. There's a world where I, just me, alone exist, because that's possible. There's a world where I am Superman, because that's possible. Lots of worlds where I don't exist. There's lots of worlds that are exactly like this, where your hair is just parted the other way, but otherwise it's exactly like, and these are real, and people are actually there. He believed that. I think that's kind of weird. He believed that he believed in what's called automatic composition, meaning he believed that there exists objects made up of any two things in the whole universe, which means there is an object, which you may not have a name for, but it's a thing that is composed of this microphone, the Eiffel Tower, and that clock, and that's a thing. And I think that's weird. But it didn't mean he wasn't smart. So a couple of things. Give people credit, be charitable to them, try to understand their views, be fair with them, but don't tolerate untruth. Like, I'm not saying just accept it all. If you think something's wrong, be bold about it. I think it's wrong. Here's why I think it's wrong. Today, I really only did the gap theory. I think the gap theory is wrong. I say it gladly and proudly. But I also don't think people are dumb for believing the gap theory. I think very smart people, many people much smarter than I believe that theory. And I know that lots of people have good reasons for it. I just gave you a couple of reasons for why I don't believe it. That's all. And maybe I'd change my mind if after a long period of time, somebody talked me into it because they had some other reasons I hadn't thought of. And maybe that time would come and I go, oh my goodness, I never thought of it that way. Because that has happened my whole life. I've never thought of it that way. And then I changed my mind.